I'm Darby Orcutt from North Carolina State University. I'm going to get us started. I will say that we've got a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to try to cover it in summary form. Happy to share details later. Pardon me for working a little bit off notes, more so than I usually do, because we got a lot of information to cover in a short time. And Bruce and I both want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So go ahead and strap in, because we're going to move fast. We're going to be talking about big deals today, but I'm going to spare you even the briefest of histories of how we got to this point. I'm sure you know. I'm also going to spare you any discussion of possible long-term remedies, how open access or read and publish or reform of the tenure system or whatever new economic or cultural model is going to completely change everything. It's not that I don't think these things are important, and in fact, it's not that I don't think that librarians should be thinking hard about the future and our further futures. Shameless plug, in the Against the Grain that you got in your packet, you'll find my first column on the future of libraries. So I'm thinking hard about those things, but for this session right now, we're not going to be thinking about those ideal solutions. We're going to be looking at not the things that are going to shake up the big deal landscape over the long haul, because I don't think it's going to change completely in the next year. And that's probably when our institution will be looking at doing our next serials review. That apocalyptic moment we prophesied for years is essentially here. Inflation, flat budgets, and reduced buying power have placed us imminently at that moment where we literally cannot afford all of our big deal journal packages. We have renegotiated, we have trimmed around the edges, we have canceled deeply among our individually subscribed titles, and yet there is soon simply to be no more blood from this stone. Our collections team has been absolutely amazing to limp us along to the point that we are, but something is going to have to give very soon. So I'm going to be pragmatic today. While I'd be fine with our libraries and our campus together taking some principled stance, we managed to do it together 15 years ago. We have to be prepared to make decisions based simply on our users' needs and cost efficiency. I'm a huge fan, huge advocate of data-informed decision-making. If you heard the first part of Ivy Anderson's talk earlier today, that's a great prelude for the background I would give you had we longer time. What's always bothered me about our data-informed decision-making around journals is that we really spend a lot of time looking at sheer usage data. The number of uses, their corollary cost per use are about the only metrics, other than citations and such, that we have to compare large quantities of journal titles. On a title-by-title basis, individual selectors might have a sense of how individual titles are being used, but they might be wrong, and certainly it's a lot to ask them to consider thousands and thousands of titles. So I wondered if there might be a way through analytics to model how journals might be being used, particularly of whether their use was predominantly for research or instructional purposes. As a large academic library, I feel the need to a large extent, privilege research use of our collection. Think of the 80-20 rule here. I also had a strong sense that much of our journal article use might be what I call replaceable, meaning that if that particular article weren't there, then the user wouldn't necessarily miss it. They'd simply move along to something that we did have. This might be a student, for example, looking for 3 peer-reviewed sources for an English 101 paper. If the one isn't there, well, they're just going to use something else. Regardless, these needs where, if it's not there, the user moves along to something else and not expressing the need, reaching out to the library, is potentially a really significant amount of our usage in terms of the sheer usage numbers. And I think that this is reflected when a lot of vendors will give us turnaway statistics for non-subscribed titles. And oftentimes they'll report 200, 300 turnaways a year for a particular journal title. but we will go and look to our ILL request and find that they are a whopping 0. So this certainly points to something going on with discovery, but not, perhaps creating use, but not necessarily reflecting actual need. So yes, I am absolutely aware of the fact that not everyone is as quick to ask for something and so on and so forth. But remember that we're not operating in the ideal world here. We have to look at relative measures and do things that assume things like a large number of ILO requests likely represents a greater campus need than 0. Similarly, with our big deals, we are most concerned with their value relative to one another at this point. Even if we truly believe that they all provide tremendous value, we're at the point where we cannot sustain them all under current terms, so we're going to need to cut, or we're going to need to really tremendously negotiate better pricing. I'd also been bothered much more by the more database model of several large publishers and how that can and can't be compared easily with title-by-title subscriptions. Certainly is the case that the majority of any big deal is comprised of titles that wouldn't stand a chance of being individually subscribed at our institution. But the deal incentivizes their inclusion because of otherwise exorbitant list prices for the journals that you do want. We had previously crunched the numbers every which way and found that even if we eliminate the long tail usage in the packages, just look at the things that are being more highly used, the sheer cost of use calculations, they're in the realm of what looks to be acceptable, what looks to be reasonable for the most part. But then even if we cut all of the but journals that we saw that saw relatively high use, then subscribe to these at list price, again, we're spending virtually the same amount, if not more, than we are for the entire deal. So that doesn't really help us when you have to cut a big deal. It also, again, seemed like much of the use might actually be a side effect of easy discovery, and that a highly used interface from say, a particular publisher drove higher use of its titles in general. Even apart from their long tails, the larger silos seem to be driving high use. So what do we do with that? I started thinking about the data sources that we have. And I realized that while we always look at counter usage on a year-to-year basis, we actually have it there on a month-to-month basis. I hypothesized that if we were to plot out the month-to-month usage of a journal on a graph, then a journal that was predominantly used for teaching purposes would see pronounced spikes in usage in those months corresponding to the academic teaching cycles of the institution, and a journal used predominantly for research would exhibit a much more consistent usage, or a flat line, over the course of the year. We tested this out on a select number of journals and found that these two basic patterns seemed fairly easily discernible, at least to the human eye. It was enough to make me wonder whether I might really be onto something here. But I also knew that I'd have to find some way of automating the placement of the individual journals into research and teaching profiles, because I certainly wasn't going to look at thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of journals, one graph by one graph. So enter my co-author. There's a graduate statistical consulting class at NC State that solicits projects from faculty to partner with a PhD student. So I applied to this, and I was assigned Yuan Tian, who's a PhD student in the Department of Statistics. She's been a fabulous addition to the project. And in fact, I said, your name's going right here on this as a co-author. She's been wonderful. We tried a number of different approaches. I'm just going to summarize a few of those real quickly. First of all, we had to figure out what was an appropriate data set to use, of course. Now, we had the readily accessible, complete counter data going back for 5 years, so that was an easy thing to start with. At first, since I was interested primarily in looking at high-use titles, because I wasn't all that concerned about that long tail, those that were truly driving the cost per use and the sheer usage calculations or metrics. We started out looking at things with 100 uses or more per year. But we were suddenly looking at a much reduced data set. And when we started looking at that, we found that there were very, very few journals among those very high use journals that were conforming to the hypothesized research use profile. Although a few that did were clearly spot on with that. They corresponded to areas of very heavy research emphasis for our campus and to areas of very robust PhD programs. So promising, but not quite there yet. So we decided to lower the annual use criterion dramatically from 100 uses to 7 uses per year. We looked at journals that were consistently year on year in this 5-year data set getting 7 uses or more. Why 7? Think ILL. So this gave us a larger data set to work with and one that was large enough to really test the hypothesis. So we first applied a fairly standard ANOVA test to look in several ways at the degree of month-to-month variance in usage for each title during the course of an average year. The math looks like this. So whether or not this looks like a foreign language to you, don't worry about it right now. We'll gladly share the math in the proceedings. We also, as we get further along on this, and this is very much a work in progress right now, but as we get further along on this, we plan to share openly UAN's R code for this. We also hope to create a web-based tool for the final project when we get there. That way, anybody can drop your own counter data into the web-based tool, boom, pop out your results. But for now, what you see here is a method by which, one of the first methods we tried, where we calculated p-values for each journal, reflecting the extent to which they adhered or did not adhere to that flat or research profile. And what you see here on the left is as that line slopes up, you find a number of journals up there, something like 400 or 500, depending on where you cut off, that very clearly fit that research profile, that very flat use. Now on the other end, at the downside, you see a number of journals, again, depending on where you cut it, probably a couple of thousand or so, that fit very closely, that do not fit that research profile closely, that have large peaks or large variance in use throughout the year, the majority of journals. And one of the things that's nice about this is that we find that because there's such it dips like this, it's showing that the majority, that this delineation into these two categories by p-value is a pretty clear, seemingly real phenomenon. So here we began to get into some of the really interesting things, which are the results. For each journal, so our method here using p-values to recognize so-called research versus teaching profiles meant that we could then calculate the proportion of research-oriented titles in a given publisher package. And for comparative purposes, we treated each publisher as a package, whether or not their content is actually purchased in that way. So we have these, this pretend publisher W, another one S, another one E. These are, of course, random letters. But what you find here is that you find, again, the proportion. So this is by percentage. So for publisher W, we had the highest proportion of journals in this data set fitting this research profile. It's 17.5%. And we can bring that on down. And again, some of these are journal packages. Some of these are individually subscribed titles from a publisher that we are treating as a package for these purposes. So this is not exactly apples to oranges, but it gives us a sense of things. one very interesting point is that by our means of dividing the universe of used titles into these two categories, and we tried it also into three categories where you sort of put them into research and teaching profiles, and then that small bit that didn't really clearly fit into either one. Regardless of the method, only a small fraction of the titles showed consistent, yet not highly academic calendar dependent usage. So in other words, it's a smaller proportion that fits the research profile. It was also clear that the relative rankings and spread of the publishers did not change much depending on the exact method that we used. Whether we used p-value, depending on where we cut the p-values exactly, and also what we ended up working on was we ended up using a clustering technique rather than p-value to draw these distinctions. But regardless, this was fairly consistent across different methods, which is another indicator that we're seeing a very real, albeit a relative effect. I will note as well that we did a check on the results from a disciplinary standpoint. I had a nagging fear, which was intensified by through a conversation with a colleague of Bruce's, that our models might be simply reflecting the differences among fields. Fields that say, such as history, where journal articles might be more accessible to general readers, might have very different proportions of how they fit these profiles versus a field, say, immunology, where advanced technical knowledge might be necessary to even read the content. We looked at a very large subset of journals and put these together and ran these again by in large disciplinary sets, science and non-science, and it became pretty quickly apparent that while there might be a very small effect, it's a very small effect. Everything still came out more or less equivalent, and so this seems to be reflecting the sort of the general nature of use, at least on our campus, rather than disciplinary differences, which was good. So we then proceeded to calculate proportionally across our overall annual cost for each publisher. Now again, what you're about to see is interesting because it was most interesting when we applied it to the three publishers here that had the highest proportion of research use, but also represent by far our most expensive journal packages. And so looking at those three and bringing cost per use into this. Now again, don't read this as this is the cost, okay? This is using cost per use as calculated here as a relative indicator among these packages. Again, they may all be really, really valuable, but this is giving us a ranking of the value proposition that each holds for us from that research standpoint. These are really only real costs, if you will, to the extent that we do not value what these numbers do not have factored into them, which are two things. On the one side, remember, they exclude that long tail. They exclude all of those very seldom used journals. In negotiating one big deal a few years ago, when a vendor rep told me that even though it's used very little, that long tail is, quote, certainly worth something. I remain largely unconvinced, and in part because I imagine the product that consists of many thousands of major publisher journal titles, each of which is essentially guaranteed to receive at most a handful of uses on your campus annually. How many of you are lining up to subscribe to that? Exactly. On the other hand, what's omitted here is a whole lot of very high use titles whose usage pattern suggests that they are overwhelmingly being used for basic student research and pedagogy. Certainly, some of these titles potentially comprise both research and teaching profiles within them. Okay, so we could have a baseline research use of a journal with that pedagogical pattern mapped over it. Now we can sort of do the math on that, and we can see, you know, where that baseline more or less rests for those journals, which suggests that there are definitely some journals that are being used in that way, but it's not necessarily a large number. So again, we're not, you know, we're at this suggestive, very interesting phase right now. There's still a lot of thinking to do before the rubber meets the road and actually operationalizing these findings here, and we haven't even begun to talk about those yet at our institution. So again, we have that sort of that replaceable use that may be coincident with research use. Again, and you can't hear this enough, this approach gets at the relative research-oriented usage and its related costs. It certainly suggests that if a package or packages must be cut, here's perhaps where we should begin. And again, in real life practice, we need to balance this out with a very close look at those high use titles for possible title by title retention. And of course, as we like to smartly do in Serial's review, keep a pot of money for summary and statements as necessary. This is not something that is this is not a method that's going to give you precise results at the title by title level, but it is very, very informative, I think, in aggregate. And anecdotal evidence from schools who have already canceled big deal packages suggests that, you know, they say that they've had very few complaints. And maybe this study is explaining why. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Darby. I want to make sure we leave plenty of room for questions because I can tell from the audience that there are a lot of questions based on what you just talked about. Let me state first that I'm going to talk about something almost completely different, but it was really spurred by my conversation with Darby this summer about this hypothesis of research versus teaching use. And I knew that he was going to be looking at his big deal packages. He had a particular sort of effort that he wanted to get through. And I thought, well, wow, it'd be interesting to look at that across the set of JSTOR content, because we have about 2,500 titles, but they're mostly focused in the humanities and social sciences. And I was kind of curious, does it look the same? Does it look different? This sort of thing. And the methodology hadn't really been fleshed out yet by Darby and his PhD student. And so we kind of just took the data at JSTOR and started to look at it in different ways. And I will, like Darby said, this is sort of the beginning of this, but it really got us to thinking about how libraries potentially want to mine data usage to actually begin to make decisions, or to think about how they use some of this data to connect themselves more concretely to the institutional goals, whether it's student success, whether those things happen to be. Is there something in this data that allows us to begin telling an institution to begin telling a story? So I didn't come in with any particular agenda. I was just curious. So what I discovered is interesting, but not compelling yet. So I kind of equate it to when my youngest 17-year-old daughter calls me and wants to stay out an hour past her curfew. I often tell her that I find her argument interesting, but not compelling. right? All right. So the original hypothesis, Darby talked a little bit about can we kind of look at data and kind of decide what looks more researchy and what looks like more instructional or teaching. And so what we did is we pulled all the usage data for the 2,000 plus titles in the JSTOR Arts and Sciences collections over the last 5 academic years. And we started to look at that usage in different ways. We looked at it by collection, Arts and Sciences 1 versus Arts and Sciences 15. We looked at it by discipline, history, humanities, social sciences, broad disciplines, small disciplines. We looked at it at the title level, just to see what we would begin, if we could see anything in there that was telling us or that would lead us to other research questions that we might want to answer. So I'm going to go through show some data. For those of you in the back, it's going to be difficult for you to see it. I'm not going to talk through the data so much as just to show you some general concepts here. So what you're looking at here is a heat map as well as sort of a academic year use for a particular journal. This one is Shakespeare Quarterly, all right? And this is one of the titles that's in our Arts and Sciences 1 collection. And as you can see, it sort of has that high peaks, low troughs, that sort of use that Darby talked about a little bit that might look a little more instructional or a little more teaching. It kind of has that natural flow that you would see. This is the Journal for the American Statistical Association. So as you can see, it's a little flatter. The peaks and the troughs are not quite as high. It's a little more stable in its overall use. And for most people, they might think about Shakespeare Quarterly as more on the teaching side, and Journal of American Statistical Association is a little more on the researchy side. I mean, they might think about it that way. So we looked at these types of things across all of the titles. But what we found is we found a lot of these types of journals. So this is William and Mary Quarterly, right? So it has a lot of use that has elements of looking like high peaks and low troughs. But actually, when you look at the low troughs, the aggregate usage, which you can't see from the back but is at the bottom bar chart, the aggregate use of that title is actually very high. So even at the trough, the use of that title is very high. That might indicate research use, even at that bottom trough level, right? So the type of use is very important here, like how it's being used and where it's being used. And that's what you can't get from obviously looking at just aggregate statistics here. So the other thing we started to look at, and this is a complicated slide and it's really hard to see here, but we started to look at different groups of titles for different types of institutions, kind of trying to measure their intensity, how much they were used, their consistency, were they used like every month of the year or were they used only in certain months of the year, right? And then trying to measure their variance to see what's the actual difference between the minimum number of times it was used and the maximum number of times it's used. Because if that variance is larger, that might look more teaching. If it's smaller, it might look a little more researchy if the amount of use was significant enough. So we took a look at, for instance, this is the humanities plot. The top plot of what you see is a small liberal arts school with 3,000 students, okay? And the middle plot you see is a large land-grant university with about 33,000 students. And the bottom one is a large comprehensive university with about 30,000 students. Now, in general, what you're seeing in increments, the sort of dividing lines here, is how big the variance is. As the plot moves out to the right, the variances between the low number of uses and the high number of uses is big. As you move to the left, the variances are very small, right? So the more that you see things moving to the left, probably indicates they're being used a little more for research. If they move to the right, it's probably a little more on the teaching side. So we were just trying to look at these things at a discipline level. This happens to be the humanities, the 18 humanities titles that are in arts and sciences 1. When we look at the 33, when we look at the 33 social sciences titles that are in arts and sciences 1, you can see it moves a little more distinctly to the left for the large public and the large land grant, right? So, and you can see, it's hard to see on here, but the intensity is measured by the colors. So we're trying to look at this as several different dimensions, trying to understand what dimensions actually impact research and teaching in that way. So you can look at a plot that is way out there on the right for this large comprehensive. It's a title that has a huge variance. It was only used in 5 months out of the year, so its actual consistency of use was not very high. If we pull that title out and look at that usage for, I think it was for 2015, you can see that almost all that usage happened in the month of October. 13 of the 17 uses happened in the month of October. That might suggest that maybe someone assigned it in a syllabus, perhaps. We don't know. It could be that someone looked at that title or looked at articles in that title as one person, looked at 13 different articles in that title. We don't really know, but that's the interesting piece about this, is you can start to look at these things at the discipline, at the title, at the month level, and start to look potentially at what is tying to syllabi, what are other things that are going on with these titles. Now, as Darby said, no one wants to look through thousands of these graphs and start to understand it. And frankly, we were having a hard time. The title of my talk was "A Hammer in Search of a Nail." Like, we felt like we had an interesting data set here, but what would people do with it? Because we couldn't quite figure out. It was interesting stuff, but what problems were you going to try to solve with it? What questions were you trying to answer? So we went and talked to 5 or 6 of our institutions who are part of our library advisory group, and talked to some of the people who do data analysis, do statistics, and they kind of came up with the same thing. I'm gonna move quickly here because I want to get to the questions. They all thought that if a data set like this was made available that they could mine, that certainly they thought there were things that they might be able to do to make informed content decisions, that they might be able to better show the value of meeting the goals of the institution, or even working more collaboratively with faculty. They all thought there might be something there, but no one could really point to a question or a problem they were trying to solve in those meetings. So we kind of walked away from those conversations thinking, okay, there's an interesting concept here that libraries may want to start mining data usage, as Darby has done, in a much more relevant way to this decision making. But it was really unclear with JSTOR's data set what people would do with it. And even if we did make the data set available, most of these institutions told us to a point that they don't have the staff or the expertise on the staff to typically do this at scale. And that was a real issue. Even so, if we were going to provide something like this for data mining, we might have to provide some real, not only education, but tool sets, as Darby's trying to do with potentially putting a tool set out there that people could use very easily. And what everyone said to a person was, I know there's something here. It'd be really cool if JSTOR could do a pilot with a couple of institutions that can really look into this stuff and see if there's some real value in here that we could distribute and tell people about across the multitude of institutions that are using JSTOR. So a little different look at it from the way Darby did it. I wasn't really looking at the big deal side. I was more interested if we could create a data set for institutions to mine of data usage. Could they do it? How would they do it? And what questions would they want to answer? And I stand up here before you saying that all that is very inconclusive right now from our perspective. So I'll stop there, and let's get to some questions that I know you all have for Darby.
Or Bruce.
come up to the microphone here. And I think they're recording this session, so.
I have a question for Yuan. So what you have is a 5-year data set for these titles, right?
Yes.
Okay, and one of the things I'm sorry, David Tyler, Nebraska. Okay, one of the things we're interested in Nebraska is whether or not these big journal packages behave like ergodic or non-ergodic systems, by which I mean year after year after year, do they look the same, or do the journals jump up and down, jump up and down? So the question I have is whether or not, in looking at particular journals 1 year after the other, if you scored them on the basis of their researchiness, are they researchy every year, or do they bounce back and forth from being a teaching journal to being a research journal?
That's a great question. That's definitely something that we looked at. I just didn't have time to go into that. We looked for a couple of things there to make sure we weren't going off track. One was just what you said, to make sure that the usage patterns year on year were consistent at the journal level, and almost to a one, yes. The other thing is that we also looked to make sure that there weren't particular outliers within any of our data set, within any of our data where maybe there was, one could imagine that, maybe an article got assigned to a really large class and like everybody read it in October 2015, and so you had this huge spike. There were very, very few of those, extremely few. And so we looked at the variance, we ran variance tests, we looked at median usage, and we looked at mean usage, and so yeah, we considered all of that. Great question.
I'm Angela Flanner from College of Charleston. It seems that you're kind of resting on the assumption, I guess, that the teaching journals the articles are more replaceable than the research journals. Do you have real evidence of that? Because I can definitely see my faculty members telling me that a certain journal is the one they are going to use in their class, and that is the one that they need.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's absolutely the case. I mean, I think that, again, this is looking at this in aggregate. This is looking at the package or publisher level. I'm certainly not suggesting that you can lose all of your journal subscriptions, because then where would they go? But maybe maybe the implication of this is maybe we don't need 3 big deal packages. Maybe we need 1 and targeted individual titles from the other publishers, or maybe we can rely on aggregated content for a lot of that teaching use. There are certainly going to be individual differences, but that same faculty member may say, I really need this journal to teach with, is not going to come to you with a list of 1,000 journals that they need to teach with. And that's the scale that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I just want to say that was one of the things we were interested in looking at, being primarily humanities and social sciences, and wanting to look at different types of institutions to see how that usage differed. Yeah. Obviously, Darby's at a particular type of institution, right, as are you. So when you look at those uses, they have to be thought about in a very local way in what you're trying to accomplish at the institution. So those charts, that's why we're looking at intensity and consistency and variance, because something may be used 13 times, but it may be the article that professor thinks is the most important thing for that particular class.
Yeah, that's stuff. Yeah, I really appreciated both of your presentations, but I also felt like I've looked at similar types of things and just been like you said, I don't know exactly what to do with this information because I can't make cancellation decisions based on that.
Yeah, well, and again, this is for relative decision making, and this is to inform decision making. I'm certainly not advocating for, sheer data driven decision making.
Good afternoon, Bob Schwartzwalder, Stanford. I'm intrigued by the analysis, and there are a couple of things I wanted to ask. One, when you looked at that research quotient, did that vary much year by year? Did you look at that on an annual basis to see what sort of variance you found in it, or was it fairly standard?
We did look, and it was fairly standard.
Okay. Did you look at certain disciplines that have intensive field work, summer field work, archaeology, geology, for instance, to see whether that affected outcomes for journals in those disciplines?
No, I'm interested in getting a little bit more into the weeds at a very specific disciplinary level. We looked at it mainly in very large levels, so STEM journals versus non-STEM journals. And we found similar patterns there, but we certainly didn't target in at the like the department or the specific subject level.
My last question really is, it seems like this would be somewhat dependent upon the areas of focus for research, in particular university.
Absolutely.
Has anyone else done a similar analysis that you could compare their results to yours?
No, and that's why I'm hoping that we'll be able to have this web tool available, and honestly, I would love it if once we have that up, we may ask that if folks are using that, if they don't mind sharing their data confidentially, because I think that's one of the open questions for me is how reflective are these patterns of our institutional context, or to what extent are they reflective of particular journal titles? Are some journals just more teaching oriented or research oriented? I'm sure that that's probably the case. So I'm really interested to know, does that local context really mean enough to move the needle in this type of study?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Chris Palzova. I'm the head of collections over at Emory in Atlanta. And I think an interesting addition to this, I think we're working on locally at Emory, and we're going to be presenting probably at ALA and probably at maybe Charleston next year, we'll see, is using data such as easy proxy data and authentication to kind of get down more granular in terms of what populations and what constituencies on campus are actually utilizing this, and then possibly looking at when as well. It might be a nice addition to it, so it's a little bit of a plug. But also I think this is extremely interesting in terms of just the nature and the research cycle and the cycle of universities and so forth. But it would be really interesting if you could see if students, undergraduate students were using most of this particular journal during this period of time. And then in the summer that really tapers off, and mostly faculty then who are using journals X, Y, and Z. So that's not such a question. I think these are nice and very fruitful for kind of additions to this sort of research, and kind of a nice kind of base level to kind of start having some of those conversations as well, just for a fuller, more kind of systematic pattern. Again, and it might be very contextual too, a lot of that, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, I mean, if we were not a public university and we were Facebook, we might have our users log in, we might have much more detailed information, we might be able to actually figure out these things, but we have other concerns, and so we have to.
All right, I guess this will be the last question.
So I'm Jason Price from Scalp Library Consortium. So kind of along very similar lines, have you thought about trying to understand the patterns better by looking at article level use in a subsample of the titles, like taking titles that you see in one category and the other category, and if you haven't, I mean, do you have that data available? I was thinking of whether JSTOR has it, whether it's something you have talked about.
I mean, we certainly have the data available. It's interesting. I had a great conversation with the folks, the analytics folks at Columbia, about how they might use this. And they thought they talked about this in particular, that you just brought up. But then they got to think about what problem were they trying to solve, and knowing that, they began to struggle a little bit, and how priority that was compared to like evaluating a big deal, right?
right? I hear that, except at the same time, I think you are looking at patterns. You're not a priori saying I'm going to know what this data means when it comes to me. And it does seem to me that if you can look at the same sort of evenness, and if you think it's a teaching title, and whether with a pattern of lots of use of a single article or broader use, and whether there's any relationship between those, that might not be that hard a thing to do, and it might help you understand a little bit better that difference. Because I do think you're sort of looking for the research which is teaching part of it. It's a hypothesis still. I think it's hard to know what that really is, and that might help just shed more light on what's going on.
I'd love to talk more about this with you, Jason. Thank you. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you.
Good job.